Today we're going to look at the social and historical context of the novella Animal Farm by George Orwell. Animal Farm was written during World War II and reflects a period of Russian history beginning with the events leading up to the 1917 Russian Revolution and ending with Stalin firmly in control of the Soviet Union. In a letter to Yvonne Devet, Orwell described Animal Farm as a satirical tale against Stalin, and in his 1946 essay Why I Write, he wrote that Animal Farm was the first book in which he attempted to fuse political purpose and artistic purpose into one whole. So to help us better understand all things historical and social, I'm enlisting the help of the best history teacher I know, Mr. Parsons. Mr. Parsons, welcome.
Mr. Watkins, good morning to you, and thank you very much for inviting me to take part in this wonderful idea of yours.
Well, great. Well, look, the first question that I'm going to ask is something that I struggled with a little bit, and that's what is the difference between historical context and social context?
Well, we could spend many hours discussing this, but I think really what you would like me to do is to keep it as simple as possible.
Absolutely.
So what I will say is this: the historical context really is looking at the events of the past, whereas the social context is focusing more on the impact that these events had on the people, the individuals concerned, and on society itself.
Great. Look, so we're going straight in and diving in. Who was Karl Marx?
Well, Karl Marx was the person who first came up with the idea of communism, and this was in the 19th century. And he basically believed that because of the way that the workers in industrialized countries were being treated, that there would become a point where there would be so many people who are unhappy with their lives, so this with society, the amount of money they were getting paid, the conditions they were living in, etc., that there would come a point where it would be breaking point, and there would be an uprising, and they would look to take over the running of the country, the running of the businesses, and there would be a revolution of the ordinary worker. And it was Karl Marx who, as I said, first came up with this idea, and he called it communism. And he believed that the first country that would experience this would be Britain. He certainly didn't believe that it was going to be Russia, as it turned out to be, which, obviously, as we now know, was not the case.
I didn't know that Britain was the first place.
Yeah, absolutely, because it was the most industrialised nation, and he saw that where the Industrial Revolution had really taken a hold, where you had these huge urban centres, mass production factories, etc., the sorts of living conditions that people had, the social conditions that people were experiencing, that this was a breeding ground for the unrest, the discontentment that would lead to the masses uprising.
That's really interesting because George Orwell sets Animal Farm in England, not in Russia. And obviously, Old Major represents Karl Marx actually in the novel. So look, I realise that there was probably not just one cause of the Russian Revolution, but maybe can you give us maybe a major cause of the Russian Revolution?
Well, I think it was sort of put down, it was stated in the words of Lenin, which, to paraphrase him, were land for the peasants, bread for the workers, and an end to the war. And, I think these were the main things that preoccupied people. The peasantry, the ordinary workers in Russia, had been treated appallingly for many, many years, had very, very few rights. They saw the lives of the privileged few, the decadences and the indulgences of the Tsar and his family, and the nobility that surrounded the Tsar's family. And they realised that there was mass inequality within society. Plus, I suppose really, what acted as a catalyst was what happened during the First World War. The Tsar set himself up as the head of the armed forces. So when things started to go wrong, and there were numerous defeats inflicted upon the Russians by the Germans, responsibility ultimately lay with the Tsar. So it was a combination of that, plus the way that the peasants were being treated on the land, conditions within the cities. Enough was enough. we've got to do something about this. And that's when people like Lenin came back from living in exile. Uh, Ironically, he was in exile in Germany, and boarded a train back to Russia, and declared the revolution as started.
Great. So we have that happening in Animal Farm as well. Obviously, when the animals rise up against Mr. Jones, who represents Tsar Nicholas II. Now, we then have the Battle of the Cowshed, which represents the Russian Civil War. What was going on with the Russian Civil War?
Well, look, history is an interesting thing. We can look back at these periods and you think to yourself, right, there'll be an uprising, an overthrowing, then everyone will be happy and we'll just sort of all go off into the sunset. And as I say, everyone will live happily ever after. But the reality is very, very different. We saw the same thing happen at the end of the French Revolution, where you get into this period of unrest. They call it the Reign of Terror in France after the French Revolution. And a similar sort of thing happened in what was to become the Soviet Union. The Russian Civil War at the end of after the revolution took place was, I suppose, this period of consolidation, where the people who have taken over power are now trying to consolidate their positions. But they also had not only political opponents within Russia itself, and obviously not everybody supported the idea of revolution, not everybody supported the idea of overthrowing the Tsar and completely changing the political and social setup in Russia. But on top of that, you had involvement from foreign powers who were very, very concerned and very worried by what they saw happening in Russia, because they thought, well, if this is happening in Russia, this could quite easily spread to other industrialized nations. So we find countries, for example, like Britain, were involved in the Civil War. So, they actually supported, sent men, sent equipment, and backed financially the opponents to the Bolsheviks.
And that's great, because in the novel, you've actually got the neighbouring farms, Mr. Pilkington and also Mr. Fredericks, who do exactly that. And I think Mr. Fredericks represents Germany, and you've got Mr. Pilkington, who represents Great Britain and maybe the USA as well. So we've then got a period where obviously Stalin and the Bolsheviks are consolidating their power. How did Stalin use propaganda to control the Russian people?
Well, look, I mean, this is again an interesting thing to look at in history. The whole idea of what Karl Marx was saying and what Lenin and people like Trotsky set up as a result of the revolution, and their ideas before the revolution took place were to do with communism. But there is a big debate as to whether Stalin was a communist. Historians are inclined to look at this period and say that this isn't a communist state. This is now a Stalinist state. And Stalin set himself up as the figure that was going to lead, as he said, Russia out of the Dark Ages into the industrialized age. And ironically, really, when you consider the reasons for revolution, that involved taking land away from the peasants and actually treating the workers even worse than they'd been treated previously, and sort of bullying and forcing the workers into his idea, or into his series of 5-year plans to bring Russia up to, as I say, up to speed, up to the 20th century. And he had a series of 5-year plans in agriculture and in industry to put into effect his ideas. He used propaganda to sell this to the people. He used propaganda to set up what we call the cult of personality. So Stalin became this supreme figurehead, but a figurehead who had considerable power. And the propaganda machine was there to convince people that what he was doing, what he stood for, what he actually said was the only way and the right way to go. And that anybody who disagreed with what he was saying was an enemy of the state. So it was very black and white. There was no grey there. You either are supporting what Stalin says, or you're not supporting what Stalin says. And if you didn't support Stalin, then God help you, because he was very, very ruthless. There's sufficient evidence to say that Stalin was the biggest mass murderer of the 20th century, responsible for the deaths of more people than Adolf Hitler. And most of those people's deaths that he was responsible for were his fellow countrymen. So, people of the Soviet Union.
Brilliant. And look, I think what Mr. Parsons has touched on really well there is the industrialisation of Russia, which is obviously represented in the novel through the building of the windmill. And also with the propaganda, have a look at the use of Squealer as a character. Mr. Parsons, absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much for your time and coming in and speaking to the class.
That's a pleasure. Anytime, Mr. Watkins.
And you've made it. I just want to finish by recapping some of the most important information in the video. Animal Farm was written during World War II, and it represents the uprising of the working class in Russia in the early 20th century. Mr. Parsons defined historical context as the events of the past, and social context as the impact that these events had on people, individual, and society. Mr. Parsons also talked about Karl Marx, who is known as the father of communism. Marx predicted the uprising of the working class in the Communist Manifesto, which was first published in 1848. In Animal Farm, the character of Old Major represents Karl Marx. I then asked Mr. Parsons about the Russian Civil War, and he informed us of the Germany and Britain's involvement in the war, supplying the White Army, the anti-Bolsheviks, with men, equipment, and money. These industrialised nations feared the potential spread of communism. In Animal Farm, the neighbouring farms owned by Mr. Fredericks and Mr. Pilkington represent Germany and Great Britain. Once Stalin had established his power, he initiated the rapid industrialisation of the Soviet Union through a series of 5-year plans. As a result of his industrialisation, the working class has less and is more poorly treated than they were pre-revolution. The industrialisation of the Soviet Union is represented in Animal Farm with the building of the windmill. Like Stalin, Napoleon used propaganda and manufactured figures to convince the suffering workers that their lives had never been better. And that's it. A huge thank you to the wonderful Mr. Parsons for sharing his immense knowledge of Russian history. If you enjoyed the video, we'd love to hear from you, so please comment, or like us, or best of all, subscribe. Thanks so much for watching.